It was still dark when the unmarked sedans rolled quietly into St. Matthew's Retirement Parish, their headlights cutting thin beams across the Arizona desert dawn. At 5:42 a.m. on May 11, 2023, neighbors in the quiet suburb of Glendale awoke to a sight they would never forget. FBI agents swarming the modest beige brick residence of a man many in the community once called Father Thomas. But this morning there were no blessings, no prayers. Only a pair of trembling hands raised above a frail head and the sharp click of steel handcuffs locking into place. The man being led down the front steps that morning was 83 years old. He had served nearly 5 decades in the Catholic Church, baptizing babies, presiding over weddings, comforting the dying. But to detectives watching from across the street, he was not a shepherd. He was a suspect, and the charges awaiting him would rock the church to its foundations. The cold case murder of a 23-year-old woman, unsolved for more than 3 decades. News spread fast. Within hours, parishioners were gathered outside the station, clutching rosaries and shaking their heads in disbelief. "It's impossible," one elderly woman whispered through tears. "Father Thomas baptized my children." Another parish member was less forgiving. "We always knew something was off. Always." Across Arizona, and eventually across the country, headlines blared the same words. Priest arrested in 1990, cold case. For many, the arrest raised more questions than it answered. How could a man who had spent his life serving God be capable of something so monstrous? What happened all those years ago? And why had the church remained silent? To understand the full weight of that morning, we have to go back to the blistering summer of 1990, when a disappearance in a small Arizona town would mark the beginning of a nightmare that refused to die. The heat that summer was relentless, the kind that bakes the desert soil into cracked red clay and sends the scent of dust swirling through the air. In the town of Belridge, a sleepy community tucked between Tucson and Phoenix, church bells marked the passing of each hour, and life moved slowly beneath the shade of mesquite trees. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where doors were left unlocked and children rode bikes until dusk without fear. On June 17, 1990, that peace shattered. At 7:20 p.m., a call came into the Belridge Police Department. A woman named Maria Valdez, a local college student and volunteer at St. Cecilia's Parish, had not returned home. Her mother reported that she'd been last seen after Sunday Mass, heading toward the parish rectory to drop off choir materials. She was never seen again. At first, no one panicked. Maria was responsible but also spontaneous. Maybe she'd gone out with friends. Maybe she'd stayed behind for a late choir meeting. But as night fell and the desert sky turned black, worry began to creep in. By morning, volunteers were combing the streets, posting flyers on telephone poles and gas station windows. Police searched alleyways and storm drains, dry riverbeds and abandoned lots. Nothing. Maria was more than just another missing person. She was deeply woven into the fabric of Belridge, a kind-hearted 23-year-old known for her bright laugh and boundless optimism. She was studying education at the University of Arizona, hoping to become a teacher. She sang every Sunday in the parish choir, tutored children in the church basement on weeknights, and had recently been selected to represent the diocese on a youth mission trip to Mexico. In a town like Belridge, where Catholicism wasn't just a religion but a way of life, Maria was the daughter everyone claimed as their own. And so, the community rallied. Search parties stretched into the nearby foothills. Helicopters swept the desert brush. Priests led nightly vigils, lighting candles and praying for Maria's safe return. Yet with each passing day, hope dimmed. Then, 3 weeks after her disappearance, a rancher checking fence lines on the outskirts of town stumbled upon something that made his knees buckle. A rosary, half buried in the sand, tangled around the remains of a young woman's wrist. The body was decomposed, weathered by the unforgiving desert sun, but dental records confirmed what Belridge had feared most. It was Maria Valdez. The discovery shook the community to its core. People who had prayed for a miracle now found themselves praying for justice. And yet, justice remained elusive. There were no obvious signs of struggle, no fingerprints, no witnesses. The medical examiner determined Maria had likely died from blunt force trauma, but the weapon was never found. Investigators traced her last known movements, from the church to the rectory, but the trail went cold just steps from where she'd last been seen. Still, whispers began to circulate. Some parishioners claimed they'd seen Maria talking to a man in clerical clothing near the church entrance that evening. Others swore they'd overheard arguments between her and a senior priest weeks before she vanished. But when pressed for details, no one could say for sure. And within months, the case that had once gripped the entire state of Arizona faded from headlines and into the unsolved files of the Belridge Police Department. For more than 30 years, the murder of Maria Valdez would remain one of Arizona's most haunting mysteries, a wound that never fully healed. Families moved away, the church quietly reassigned clergy, and parishioners stopped speaking her name. But not everyone forgot, and not everyone was willing to let the past stay buried. Because somewhere in Belridge, walking free, preaching sermons, blessing marriages, was a man who knew exactly what happened to Maria. And in 2023, his secrets would finally catch up with him. The discovery of Maria Valdez's body on the outskirts of Belridge on July 8, 1990, jolted the small desert town into a state of fear it had never known. The young woman's death was not just a tragedy. It was a violation of a community's deepest sense of safety, a wound that bled distrust into every corner of daily life. Within hours of the confirmation, the Belridge Police Department launched one of the most exhaustive investigations in its history. Detectives began with the basics, retracing Maria's last known movements. Witnesses at St. Cecilia's Parish confirmed she'd been present at Sunday evening Mass. Several members of the choir recalled seeing her around 6 p.m., smiling and chatting as she collected hymnals and sheet music. At 6:20, she'd been seen walking toward the rectory to return materials. After that, she vanished. The search radius extended outward from the church in concentric circles. Officers canvassed nearby homes, shops, and the narrow alleyways behind the parish. They spoke with vendors who'd been packing up from the weekly street market. A few thought they'd seen Maria walking with someone, a tall man, dressed in dark clothing, but no one could provide a face or name. The lack of solid eyewitness accounts was frustrating. Belridge was small, but it was also tightly knit, the kind of town where strangers stood out. And yet, whoever had taken Maria had managed to do so without anyone noticing. Forensic work, though rudimentary by today's standards, began immediately. Investigators collected soil samples, hair fibers, and partial footprints from the shallow grave site. A broken rosary bead believed to belong to Maria was carefully bagged and logged as evidence. But beyond confirming that she died from blunt force trauma, likely inflicted by a heavy object, the autopsy offered little else. There was no sign of sexual assault, no defensive wounds. The absence of obvious motive baffled detectives. Robbery was quickly ruled out. Maria's watch and small silver crucifix remained on her body. Attention soon shifted to those closest to her. Her family, though devastated, were cooperative. Maria's parents spoke tearfully of their daughter's dreams, how she'd hoped to teach elementary school, how she never missed a Sunday service, how she was saving money to buy her first car. They insisted she had no enemies, no troubled relationships, and had never mentioned anyone making her uncomfortable. But one detail did raise an eyebrow. In the weeks leading up to her death, Maria had seemed anxious, distracted. "She told me she felt like someone was following her," her mother whispered during an interview. "I told her it was just nerves. Now, I wish I'd listened." Detectives combed through Maria's personal life. Friends described her as friendly but private. She wasn't dating anyone. She didn't drink or go out late. But she had confided in one close friend about something troubling happening at the church. The friend couldn't elaborate. Maria hadn't shared details. But the lead was enough for investigators to probe deeper into the parish itself. The priests and staff at St. Cecilia's were questioned. Most expressed genuine shock and sorrow, yet there were inconsistencies. Father Raymond, the parish's senior priest, claimed he'd left the church by 6:30 that evening and had seen nothing unusual. Another staff member, however, recalled seeing his car parked outside well past 7. When pressed, Raymond grew defensive, insisting he'd remembered the timeline incorrectly. He wasn't considered a suspect, but his shifting statements did not go unnoticed. Other threads emerged, each more puzzling than the last. A maintenance worker reported seeing a sedan idling behind the parish for nearly 15 minutes the night Maria disappeared. The car was gone by the time he returned. A teenage altar server told police that Maria had been arguing quietly with a man in clerical robes 2 weeks before her death, though he couldn't hear what they were saying. And a parish secretary mentioned an anonymous letter Maria had received that spring, written in shaky handwriting and signed only, "A friend." The letter warned her to be careful who you trust. Despite these hints, the investigation hit wall after wall. Leads fizzled. Witnesses contradicted each other, and the community's initial fervor began to fade as weeks turned into months with no arrests. Pressure mounted on law enforcement. Local newspapers ran headlines like, "Murder of beloved choir singer still a mystery," and Belridge police running out of leads. Town hall meetings grew heated. Some accused investigators of protecting the church. Others blamed outsiders. Conspiracy theories flourished. The Belridge police chief, Robert Kenny, held a press conference 6 months after the murder, vowing not to give up. "This case is not cold," he insisted. "We are following every lead, and we will bring Maria's killer to justice." But behind the scenes, the investigation was stalling. Forensic technology in 1990 had its limits. DNA analysis was still in its infancy. Security cameras were rare. And without a suspect, a weapon, or a clear motive, the case was little more than a tragic mystery. By the summer of 1991, the search had grown quieter. Detectives were reassigned to other cases. Evidence was boxed up and archived. Maria's parents continued to attend every press conference, pleading for answers. Each year, they organized a candlelight vigil at the site where her body was found, their faces etched with the kind of grief that never truly heals. Rumors lingered, though. Whispers about the church's involvement, about people in positions of power who might know more than they were saying. But no charges were filed, no arrests were made, and the man who had taken Maria's life, and whoever he was, had vanished as completely as she once had. The desert winds moved on. Belridge moved on. But beneath the calm surface, something was festering. And as the years slipped by, the truth lay buried, not beneath the sand, but beneath layers of silence, secrecy, and shame. Before she became the name on candlelit posters and the face on flyers tacked to telephone poles, Maria Valdez was a daughter, a sister, a friend, and the quiet heartbeat of St. Cecilia's parish. Born in 1970 to working-class parents in Belridge, Arizona, Maria grew up surrounded by desert skies and the low hum of cicadas. Her father, Thomas, worked at a copper refinery on the edge of town. Her mother, Rosa, cleaned houses for families in the upscale neighborhoods just west of the highway. Money was always tight, but love was abundant. And Maria, the eldest of 3, carried that love with her wherever she went. She was known for her kindness, the sort of kindness that wasn't loud, but always present. Teachers remembered her as a diligent student, classmates described her as soft-spoken but determined, and parishioners saw her as the embodiment of faith itself. At 23, she still lived at home, saving money while attending night classes at a local college. Her dream was simple, yet ambitious, to teach literature and someday travel to Spain, the country where her grandparents were born. Maria's faith was central to her identity. She had been singing in the church choir since she was 9. She led Bible study for teens on Wednesdays, and on weekends, she helped organize food drives with Father Raymond and the parish volunteers. But in the weeks before her death, those closest to her noticed subtle changes. She wasn't herself, recalled her younger sister, Elena. She seemed distracted, distant even. I asked her if something was wrong, but she brushed it off. She said everything was fine. But everything wasn't fine. In her final month, Maria's journal, later recovered by detectives, revealed small but troubling hints of something darker beneath the surface. There were mentions of unwanted attention, conversations that made her uncomfortable, and one chilling entry dated June 29, 1990. If I disappear, I hope they look here at the church. Investigators would later learn that Maria had confided in a close friend about a man who had begun showing up unexpectedly. At choir practice, at her college campus, even outside her home. He was someone she knew, someone connected to the parish. Still, Maria tried to maintain a normal routine. In the week leading up to her death, she spent most of her time preparing for the church's annual summer festival. On July 5th, she stayed late to help decorate the parish hall. On the 6th, she attended a youth choir rehearsal. On the 7th, she met a friend for coffee and confided that she was thinking about leaving Belridge for a teaching job in Phoenix. It was the first time she had spoken seriously about leaving. Her final day, Sunday, July 8th, unfolded like any other. She woke early, helped her mother prepare breakfast, and attended morning mass with her family. Afterward, she stayed behind to organize hymnals and finalize plans for the evening service. Witnesses remember her smiling, laughing, and humming as she worked. At 5:45 p.m., she made a brief phone call from the church office, the last confirmed record of her voice. By 6 p.m., she was seen chatting with Father Raymond and another parish volunteer in the courtyard. At 6:20, she walked toward the rectory to return a folder. And then, she was gone. The next 24 hours were a blur of panic and confusion. When Maria didn't return home that night, her mother called the church. No one had seen her. Calls to friends went unanswered. By midnight, her parents were driving the streets of Belridge, searching every corner of town. At dawn, they reported her missing. Police initially treated the case as a potential runaway, a frustratingly common practice in the early 90s, especially with young adults. But Maria's family insisted she would never disappear voluntarily. She had plans, responsibilities, and most importantly, a deep sense of duty to her family and faith. Something had happened to her. They were sure of it. Over the next 2 days, investigators retraced her last known steps. They spoke with everyone at the parish. They checked nearby bus stations, hospitals, and shelters. Nothing. Maria had vanished without a trace. And then, on July 8th, just 48 hours after she was last seen, a groundskeeper discovered a shallow grave in a dry, brush-covered lot less than a mile from St. Cecilia's. The woman buried there was still wearing Maria's silver crucifix. For Belridge, the discovery was more than a tragedy. It was a betrayal. How could something so monstrous happen to someone so gentle and so close to a place considered sacred? How could a young woman vanish from the heart of a church and end up dead in the desert? Detectives kept circling back to the same unsettling question. Who would want to harm Maria Valdez? She had no known enemies, no history of conflict. The only clue came from those cryptic diary entries and the growing suspicion that whatever she feared had been hiding in plain sight. Even in death, Maria's story refused to settle. Rumors circulated about priests with secrets, about parish volunteers who abruptly moved away, about a confession that someone heard but never reported. But for all the whispers, no evidence surfaced. And as weeks turned into months, her memory faded from headlines and front pages, replaced by newer stories. Yet for those who loved her, the wound never closed. Her parents lit a candle for her every Sunday. Her younger siblings spoke her name before every meal. And her empty chair in the choir loft became a symbol of unfinished justice, a haunting reminder of a life cut short, and a truth still buried in silence. The world moved on. Belridge moved on. But the story of Maria Valdez did not end. It merely waited, buried beneath 17 years of dust, secrets, and guilt, for the day when the truth would finally claw its way back into the light. The investigation into Maria Valdez's murder consumed Belridge in the summer of 1990. For weeks, the desert outside town swarmed with police units, volunteer search teams, cadaver dogs, and news crews. Every inch of brush was combed for evidence. Every parishioner, neighbor, and co-worker was questioned. But for all the manpower and resources poured into the case, it felt like trying to solve a puzzle, with half its pieces missing. The crime scene itself offered little to go on. There were no tire tracks near the shallow grave, no fingerprints on the trash bags, no signs of a struggle beyond the drag marks leading from the roadside to where she was buried. The medical examiner determined Maria had died from blunt force trauma to the head, a single, deliberate blow, sometime between 6:30 and 8:01 p.m. on July 8th. But beyond that, there were no clues about who had killed her or why. Detectives interviewed more than 100 people in the first 2 weeks, from church staff to local delivery drivers. They followed up on anonymous tips about strangers spotted near the parish. They traced every car that had been parked within a half-mile radius that evening. And yet, nothing connected. Every promising lead evaporated into rumor. Every theory circled back to the same frustrating dead end. No motive, no suspect, no answers. The only consistent thread in the investigation came from those unsettling journal entries Maria had written before her death. They hinted at fear, at someone watching her, at a possible threat hiding in plain sight. Detectives zeroed in on them, but the church closed ranks quickly. Father Raymond called the insinuations outrageous and accused detectives of sowing suspicion in God's house. The diocese offered limited cooperation, citing internal protocols. Meanwhile, whispers spread among the congregation. Parishioners who once gathered joyfully after Sunday Mass now left in silence, casting wary glances at one another. Some insisted Maria's killer had to be an outsider. Others believed the truth was sitting in the front pew every week. But without evidence, suspicion remained just that. Suspicion. By September, the case had stalled. Leads dried up. Witnesses' memories faded. Media coverage shifted to newer stories. The Belridge Police Department quietly scaled back its task force. What had once been an all-consuming investigation was now a file on a shelf, its tabs growing dusty. The Valdez family refused to let it fade. Rosa and Thomas visited the police station every month demanding updates. They organized prayer vigils, spoke to reporters, even hired a private investigator for a time. But their efforts yielded nothing. It felt like Maria had been erased, Elena later said. Like she just vanished, not only from this world but from everyone's urgency to care. Years slipped by. Seasons turned. Belridge grew and changed, but Maria's case remained frozen in time. A grim photograph pinned to the Unsolved board in the homicide division. New detectives inherited the file, each bringing fresh energy and optimism, only to leave it in the same place their predecessors had, nowhere. By the early 2000s, the case had taken on a life of its own in local folklore. Teenagers dared each other to visit the lot where Maria's body was found, claiming it was haunted. Older residents spoke of the church girl in hushed tones, convinced the truth had been buried with her. Even inside St. Cecilia's, her name became a kind of taboo, mentioned only in murmurs, if at all. Behind the scenes, investigators continued to revisit the evidence whenever new technology allowed. In 1997, they attempted to extract DNA from a strand of hair found near the grave, but the sample was too degraded to yield results. In 2003, they submitted the trash bag for trace fiber analysis. Again, nothing. In 2010, they digitized all case files, hoping new digital forensics might uncover something they'd missed. It didn't. Still, one detective refused to let go. Detective Laura Henson, who joined the Belridge PD in 2012, stumbled upon Maria's case while reviewing cold files. Something about it, the vulnerability of the victim, the eerie silence surrounding the parish, the unanswered questions, gnawed at her. Over the next decade, she read every page of the investigation multiple times. She re-interviewed retired officers. She visited the site where Maria was found. She spoke to surviving family members, promising them she would not give up. Henson wasn't the first to make that promise, and many believed she would not be the last. But time was no longer on their side. Witnesses were aging, memories were fading, and many of those closest to the case, including Father Raymond, had since passed away. By 2023, Maria's murder was 33 years old. The case file, once bursting with activity, had become a relic of another era. But inside that file lay something no one had ever noticed, a piece of evidence so small it had been overlooked, mislabeled, and forgotten for decades. And that overlooked clue was about to pull the past violently into the present. By 2023, Maria Valdez's name had faded from the headlines and from most people's memories. To many in Belridge, the tragedy had become just another piece of local folklore, a cautionary tale whispered about in church basements and remembered once a year at a small candlelight vigil. But to Detective Laura Henson, it was unfinished business, and she was about to change everything. The breakthrough didn't start with a dramatic revelation or a new confession. It began, as so many cold case revivals do, with a dusty cardboard box. While conducting a department-wide evidence audit that spring, Henson came across an old brown package tucked behind several unrelated homicide files. The label was faded, but the case number was unmistakable: 90-07-118, the Maria Valdez file. Inside were familiar items: crime scene photos, autopsy reports, police interviews. But at the very bottom, sealed in a plastic bag and mislabeled as miscellaneous debris, was something she had never seen before: a small square of cloth. It appeared insignificant at first, a torn scrap of fabric, stained and fraying at the edges. But its location in the evidence bag told a different story. It had been collected from beneath Maria's fingernails during the autopsy, a sign she had likely fought back. Back in 1990, the sample was too small and too degraded for testing. But forensic science had come a long way since then. Henson immediately sent it to the state crime lab for advanced touch DNA analysis, a technology that could now pull complete profiles from even the smallest traces of genetic material. Weeks later, the results came back. The DNA belonged to a man, and it wasn't a match for anyone in the original investigation. But when the profile was uploaded into CODIS, the national DNA database, it hit on a relative match. A man in Phoenix, arrested in 2021 for aggravated assault, shared partial DNA markers with the unknown sample, likely a sibling or close family member. This discovery blew the case wide open. Investigators traced the family tree and identified a possible relative, a man named Father Thomas Brennan, a 78-year-old retired priest living quietly in Tucson. Brennan had served in Belridge in 1990, and he had worked closely with Maria at St. Cecilia's Parish Outreach Program. His name had appeared briefly in the original case file, but only as a witness who helped organize her memorial service. The idea that Brennan, a respected figure in the church with decades of service, could be connected to Maria's murder seemed unthinkable. But the evidence didn't lie. Henson's team obtained a covert DNA sample from a discarded coffee cup Brennan had thrown away outside his retirement home. The results came back within a week, a 99.98% match to the genetic material found under Maria's nails. Even then, detectives proceeded cautiously. They re-examined parish financial records and discovered several large, unexplained withdrawals from a discretionary church fund in the weeks before Maria's death. They tracked down former parishioners who remembered seeing Brennan argue with her shortly before she vanished. And one retired staff member came forward with a chilling memory. Maria had once confided that someone in the church had been making unwanted advances, and that she was thinking of going to the police. With every new piece of evidence, the picture grew clearer. Maria hadn't been the victim of a random act of violence. She had been silenced, and the man responsible had hidden in plain sight for over 3 decades, wearing a collar and preaching forgiveness. By late summer, the case file was no longer gathering dust. It was the centerpiece of a homicide task force, and the name Father Thomas Brennan, once synonymous with charity and community, was now written in bold at the top of a murder warrant. And for the first time in 33 years, the Valdez family dared to hope that justice was finally within reach. By the time the DNA results linked Father Thomas Brennan to Maria Valdez's murder, the case had shifted from a cold file to a full-scale investigation. But as any seasoned detective knows, DNA alone is rarely enough to close a 33-year-old homicide. It was the key to a door, but there was still a labyrinth of lies and silence behind it. Detective Laura Henson and the Cold Case Unit knew they needed more. They began by dissecting Brennan's movements around the time of Maria's death in 1990. The church's records showed that he had abruptly taken a spiritual retreat to a monastery in New Mexico just 3 days after Maria vanished, a trip that had never been part of his usual routine. Investigators found it suspicious. Priests rarely left their congregations without formal approval, and there was no paper trail beyond a single note in his personnel file. Digging deeper, the team discovered that Brennan had been transferred to 3 different parishes between 1989 and 1993, each move following quiet, internal complaints from parishioners. None of the complaints explicitly mentioned violence, but several hinted at inappropriate behavior toward young women in the church. All were quietly settled by the diocese, and none were reported to law enforcement. This revelation added a crucial layer to the case. Not only did it establish a pattern of predatory behavior, but it also painted a picture of an institution that might have protected Brennan rather than exposed him. And if the church had been willing to shield him once, investigators reasoned, it might have done so again. Henson's team subpoenaed decades of diocesan records, a process that triggered immediate resistance. Lawyers for the church argued that the documents were privileged, but a judge, citing public safety and the ongoing homicide investigation, ordered their release. Inside, detectives found a treasure trove of evidence. Handwritten memos discussing Brennan's boundary issues, a 1991 letter from a fellow priest expressing concern over his aggressive attachment to Maria, and most damning of all, a confidential note from the bishop himself, suggesting that Brennan had been counseled about inappropriate contact with a parish volunteer shortly before she disappeared. Meanwhile, forensic science was continuing to do what it couldn't in 1990. New luminol testing on Maria's clothing revealed faint traces of saliva on the neckline, too degraded for testing back then, but now viable for YSTR analysis, a technique that focuses on male-specific DNA markers. The results once again matched Brennan. Investigators also turned their attention to the small scrap of cloth found under Maria's fingernails. Under modern forensic microscopes, they detected trace fibers of wool, identical to the material used in the cassocks worn by clergy in St. Cecilia's Parish during the late 1980s and early 1990s. It wasn't conclusive proof by itself, but it placed Brennan at the scene in a way that was almost impossible to refute. While the scientific evidence mounted, the human side of the investigation began to shift too. Detectives tracked down several of Maria's friends and co-workers, many of whom were now scattered across the country. A handful of them shared haunting memories that had never made it into the original police reports. One recalled Maria confiding that a senior church member had been following her home after volunteer shifts. Another remembered her mentioning an ultimatum she had received shortly before she disappeared, one that terrified her so much she considered quitting the outreach program altogether. Each testimony, combined with the DNA evidence, the diocesan records, and Brennan's suspicious movements, tightened the noose. The case, once frozen in time, now pulsed with new life. And as detectives reconstructed Maria's final hours, a chilling possibility began to emerge. Her death had not been a sudden outburst of violence. It was premeditated, a deliberate act meant to silence a young woman who threatened to expose a predator cloaked in sacred robes. By late autumn of 2023, the evidence was overwhelming. Detectives had DNA linking Brennan to Maria. They had records proving he had been investigated by the church and quietly moved. They had testimonies painting a clear picture of harassment and intimidation. and for the first time in 33 years they also had a warrant, not just for questioning but for arrest. What none of them knew yet was just how deep Brennan's deception truly ran. And the moment the handcuffs clicked shut, the story would explode far beyond Belridge, rocking one of the world's most powerful institutions to its core. When detectives finally built their case around Father Thomas Brennan, they knew they weren't just pursuing a murderer. They were preparing to dismantle decades of carefully constructed deception. On paper, Brennan's life looked untouchable. To parishioners, he was a pillar of faith, a man who had baptized their children, officiated their weddings, and guided them through funerals. He'd risen steadily through the ranks of the diocese, eventually becoming a highly respected rector and a key advisor to the local bishop. But beneath that polished reputation was a history that investigators now knew had been deliberately hidden. Born in 1956 in a small town outside Phoenix, Brennan had been drawn to the priesthood early, entering seminary at just 18. His superiors often described him as intense, driven, and deeply devoted, though others quietly noted his temper and his discomfort around women. Early parish assignments were marked by complaints that rarely reached the public. He was said to be overly controlling with young parish volunteers, inappropriate with some female congregants, and once even accused of breaking into a parishioner's home under the guise of pastoral concern. Each incident was quietly buried under reassignment orders and sternly worded internal memos. The pattern was chillingly familiar to investigators who had spent years studying predatory clergy cases. Brennan wasn't just hiding a single violent act. He had spent decades building an identity that insulated him from scrutiny. By the time Maria Valdez vanished in 1990, he had already weathered 2 internal investigations and 1 lawsuit that the church settled out of court. And yet, not a single police report had ever been filed against him. What made Brennan especially dangerous was his ability to compartmentalize. Those who knew him best described 2 sides of the man: the charismatic pastor who delivered moving sermons on forgiveness, and the cold, calculating figure who seemed to enjoy power more than service. That duality was never more evident than in his journals, recovered during a search of his home in 2023. There, tucked between reflections on scripture and sermon drafts, detectives found deeply unsettling passages, cryptic entries about temptation, control, and sin that cannot be confessed. One particularly disturbing line read, "The weak are meant to be guided, even when they resist." The deeper investigators dug, the more disturbing the timeline became. Phone records from 1990, long forgotten in the evidence box, showed a flurry of late-night calls from Brennan's rectory to Maria's apartment in the weeks before her disappearance. Witness interviews revealed that Maria had confided to a friend that she felt trapped by someone in the church and was considering leaving the volunteer program entirely. And in one haunting revelation, a parish housekeeper told detectives that she had once seen Brennan arguing with Maria in the rectory hallway just days before she vanished. Maria, she recalled, looked terrified. Even after Maria's disappearance, Brennan's behavior remained suspicious. Within weeks, he had requested a transfer, a request that, according to diocesan records, was strongly supported by senior clergy. Within 6 months, he had been reassigned across the state and promoted. From there, he continued to rise in prominence, speaking at national conferences, serving. His new role placed him beyond reproach, or so he thought. For investigators, the final piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source: Brennan's financial records. A forensic accountant discovered that in the months following Maria's disappearance, a series of unexplained cash withdrawals had been made from church discretionary funds under Brennan's control. Each withdrawal was under $5,000, small enough to avoid attention, but together, they totaled over $30,000. Detectives theorized that the money may have been used to pay for legal counsel or silence potential witnesses. By the time detectives presented their findings to the district attorney, a portrait had emerged of a man who had spent more than 3 decades evading accountability. Brennan had hidden behind the church, behind tradition, behind the community's trust, and for 33 years it had worked. But science had caught up, persistence had caught up, and now finally, justice was catching up. With an arrest warrant in hand and a media firestorm brewing, investigators prepared to do something that once seemed impossible: put handcuffs on one of the most powerful men in the diocese. And when they did, the reverberations wouldn't stop at the church doors. They would shake the foundations of faith itself. The morning of September 14th, 2023, began like any other in the quiet suburb of Mesa, Arizona, until a convoy of unmarked police cars turned down a tree-lined street toward the stately brick rectory of St. Matthew's Parish. Neighbors sipping their coffee on porches froze as tactical units fanned out, their boots crunching on the gravel driveway. For more than 3 decades, Father Thomas Brennan had walked those same steps in flowing black robes, blessing children, comforting the sick, and shaking hands with parishioners who considered him a living embodiment of faith. That morning, he would leave those steps in handcuffs. At precisely 7:42 a.m., detectives with the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office approached the rectory door. The lead investigator, Detective Carla Mendoza, had spent years chasing ghosts in this case. Now, as she knocked firmly on the heavy oak door, she could feel the weight of history pressing on her chest. "Thomas Brennan," she called out, voice steady. "This is the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office. We have a warrant for your arrest." There was a long pause, then the faint shuffle of footsteps. When the door finally opened, Brennan stood framed in the doorway. Older now, his hair silver and thinning, but his eyes as calculating as ever. His clerical collar was perfectly in place. He looked from one officer to the next before finally settling his gaze on Mendoza. "What is this about?" he asked quietly. "You know what this is about," she replied. Without resistance, Brennan allowed the cuffs to be fastened around his wrists. A small crowd of neighbors and parishioners had gathered by then, drawn by the flashing lights and low hum of police radios. Some gasped, others cried openly. One elderly woman dropped to her knees clutching a rosary, whispering prayers as Brennan was led to the waiting patrol car. "This must be a mistake," someone shouted. "He baptized my grandson." Another, more cynical voice muttered, "I always knew there was something off about him." News of the arrest spread faster than wildfire. By mid-morning, helicopters hovered over the church grounds, and live broadcasts dominated local stations. "Longtime parish priest arrested in 1990, disappearance and presumed murder," read one headline. "Faith shaken in Mesa as beloved clergyman faces murder charges," said another. At the press conference that afternoon, District Attorney Elena Rodriguez stood at the podium flanked by detectives and forensic experts. "For over 3 decades," she said, "the family of Maria Valdez has waited for answers. Today, we take a significant step toward justice." The charges against Brennan were sweeping: first-degree murder, kidnapping, obstruction of justice, and abuse of authority. Investigators alleged that Brennan had used his position of trust and influence to lure Maria into a vulnerable situation, then silenced her when she threatened to expose him. DNA evidence recovered from the original crime scene, once too degraded to test, now matched traces found in Brennan's old vehicle, seized years earlier and recently re-examined. Coupled with witness statements, financial records, and his own incriminating journal entries, the case was airtight. Inside the courtroom 2 days later, Brennan appeared calm, almost detached, as he was formally charged. He pleaded not guilty, his attorney arguing that the evidence was circumstantial and the timeline flimsy at best. But prosecutors countered with decades of suppressed complaints, sealed church records, and new testimony from former parishioners who claimed Brennan had manipulated or threatened them. The fallout within the church was immediate and explosive. St. Matthew's Parish suspended services indefinitely. The diocese issued a statement expressing shock and deep sorrow, and announced an internal investigation into how Brennan had remained in ministry despite repeated red flags. National media swarmed the story, and within days, it had become a symbol of institutional failure, another painful chapter in the church's long history of scandal and silence. For Maria Valdez's family, The arrest was bittersweet. They had waited 33 long years for a name, for a face, for accountability. As her younger brother told reporters outside the courthouse, tears streaking his cheeks, "We were told to forgive and move on. But you can't forgive what you don't understand. And now, finally, we understand." The man who had once preached about salvation and redemption was now facing the full weight of earthly justice. And for a community that had spent decades revering him as a shepherd, the revelation that he might have been a predator all along left a scar that would never fully heal. The trial of Father Thomas Brennan began on a chilly January morning in 2024, more than 33 years after Maria Valdez's disappearance and murder had first shaken the small town of Mesa, Arizona. It was, by all accounts, one of the most anticipated trials in the state's history. The courthouse steps were swarmed with television crews, journalists, protesters, and parishioners clutching rosaries. For many, this was not just about a murder. It was about betrayal, power, and the reckoning of an institution that had long considered itself untouchable. Inside courtroom 4B, the atmosphere was tense but hushed. The prosecution's table was stacked with binders and exhibits, decades of evidence painstakingly re-examined and reassembled. At the defense table, Brennan sat motionless, flanked by two high-profile attorneys specializing in criminal defense. His once commanding presence had diminished. He appeared frail and tired, his hands clasped tightly together, lips moving silently in prayer. Prosecutor Elena Rodriguez opened with a statement that silenced the packed courtroom. "For 33 years, this man wore the cloth of the church and the mask of holiness," she said, pointing toward Brennan. But behind that mask was a predator who used his authority not to guide, but to manipulate, silence, and ultimately destroy. The prosecution's case unfolded meticulously, brick by brick. First came the physical evidence. Fibers found on Maria's clothing that matched upholstery from Brennan's car. Soil particles from the vehicle consistent with the wooded area where her remains had been discovered. And most damning of all, the modern DNA test results. Samples collected from beneath Maria's fingernails now conclusively matched Brennan. Then came the witness testimonies, a parade of voices from the past. Former parishioners described Brennan's influence over young women in the congregation, often cloaked in counseling sessions that blurred the lines between pastoral care and manipulation. A retired church secretary testified about late-night meetings behind closed doors. And perhaps the most devastating testimony came from a woman named Teresa, who tearfully recounted her own experience of harassment by Brennan as a teenager in 1989. Her story mirrored many details of Maria's: the grooming, the threats, the chilling warning. "If you tell anyone, no one will believe you." The defense countered by portraying Brennan as a devoted priest wrongfully accused, a scapegoat for a flawed investigation, and a public eager for someone to blame. They attacked the integrity of decades-old evidence, questioned chain of custody records, and called expert witnesses to argue that DNA degradation over time made the results unreliable. They even suggested that Maria had been involved in risky behavior and that Brennan was merely a convenient target. But the jury was unmoved. The prosecution's narrative, kind of power abused, evidence ignored, and a young woman silenced, was too compelling. The most chilling moment of the trial came when Maria's brother took the stand. Holding a faded photograph of his sister, he spoke directly to Brennan. "You buried her once, but every day for 33 years you buried us too. Our lives stopped the day hers did." The trial lasted 7 weeks. Jurors deliberated for just under 9 hours before returning their verdict. On March 4, 2024, the clerk read the words that so many had waited decades to hear. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Thomas Brennan, guilty on all counts." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Brennan sat motionless, his eyes fixed on the crucifix above the judge's bench. Judge Caroline Foster, known for her measured and uncompromising rulings, did not hold back during sentencing. "You exploited your position, betrayed your vows, and committed one of the most grievous sins imaginable, taking an innocent life, she said. And you did so under the guise of God's authority. That is a betrayal beyond forgiveness. She sentenced Brennan to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As he was led away in shackles, a hush fell over the room. Outside, reporters swarmed the courthouse steps, capturing raw emotions, tears of relief, anger, and disbelief. Some parishioners clung to their faith, insisting the church's mission remained pure. Others turned their backs on the institution entirely. For Maria's family, the verdict was a long-awaited validation. "We've waited half our lives for this moment," her mother told reporters, clutching a rosary worn smooth from years of prayer. Justice delayed is still justice, and today, Maria has finally been heard. The conviction reverberated far beyond Mesa. Dioceses across the country launched internal reviews and national conversations about power, accountability, and institutional cover-ups reignited. While the verdict could never undo what had been done, it offered a measure of closure, a reminder that no collar, no title, no sacred institution could place anyone above the law. And as the courthouse emptied and the cameras packed up, one thought lingered in the minds of many. Justice, however delayed, had finally caught up with Father Thomas Brennan. The conviction of Father Thomas Brennan did more than close a decades-old murder case. It shattered illusions that had stood unchallenged for generations. In the weeks that followed the verdict, the Diocese of Phoenix released a statement condemning Brennan's actions and promising cooperation with law enforcement in any future investigations. But for many parishioners, the words rang hollow. The same institution that had once shielded Brennan with silence now claimed ignorance, and that betrayal cut deeper than anyone expected. Across Mesa, the church pews that had once been filled every Sunday sat half empty. Stained glass windows still caught the desert sun, but the faith that had bound the community together was fractured. Some congregants clung to their beliefs more fiercely than ever, determined to separate one man's crimes from their religion. Others walked away completely, unable to reconcile their devotion with the darkness it had concealed. For Maria Valdez's family, the road to healing was only beginning. They had spent 33 years trapped in a cycle of grief and unanswered questions, their lives frozen on the day she vanished. The trial's conclusion did not erase that pain, but it did give them something they had been denied for so long: the truth. "Now we can speak her name without the weight of a question mark," her brother told a local reporter. "Now we know, and knowing is everything." The case's ripple effects extended far beyond Mesa. Across the country, prosecutors re-examined unsolved cases linked to clergy members. Cold case units reopened dormant files, and investigative journalists began digging into patterns of abuse and cover-ups that had been ignored for decades. The Brennan case became a symbol, not just of justice served, but of the accountability that could no longer be avoided. In law schools and police academies, the investigation into Maria's murder is now studied as a landmark example of perseverance and forensic advancement. It showed how evidence once considered inconclusive could become pivotal decades later, and how dogged determination, even in the face of institutional resistance, could expose the truth. As for Brennan himself, he spends his days behind the cold concrete walls of Arizona State Penitentiary. Once a powerful figure revered in his community, he is now inmate, Mutter 78244, a man stripped of titles, robes, and influence. Reports from prison officials describe him as quiet and withdrawn, spending most of his time in the chapel library, still clinging to the rituals of a faith he weaponized for evil. Every June 14th, the date Maria was last seen alive, her family gathers at a small memorial near the wooded path where her remains were found. They bring flowers and photographs, but also letters written to the young woman who never got to grow old. "We celebrate her life now, not just mourn her death," her mother said at the first vigil after the trial, "because justice has finally spoken." The story of Maria Valdez is more than just a cold case solved. It is a cautionary tale about power left unchecked, about faith corrupted by deceit, and about the relentless pursuit of truth, no matter how many years it takes. And for every family still waiting for answers, it is a beacon of hope, proof that even when justice seems buried by time, it can still rise and speak. If you found this case as haunting and powerful as we did, let us know your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe justice was truly served? And don't forget to subscribe. More shocking true crime stories are coming your way.